Joining me now is Michigan's Attorney General Dana Nessel. Madam Attorney General, thank you very much for being with us. First off, how imminent was this threat?
Well, we were obviously concerned that these activities could take place at any time. And, my perspective is this. I would rather have a weak conspiracy case than the strongest homicide case. But that being the case, of course, we think we had substantial evidence in this case. We're not just talking about a bunch of guys sitting around and talking about something. We're talking about a number of overt actions moving towards these actual plots, and not just the ones that you've talked about, of course, involving kidnapping the governor, but many other potential plots as well, taking over and potentially blowing up our state capitol building, threats against law enforcement, threats against other government officials. There's really a lengthy list of things that we were concerned about. And honestly, any of those things could have happened at any time. Certainly, there were preparations that were being made moving towards any or perhaps several of those activities.
U.S. Attorney Schneider said that it's okay to disagree about politics just there in that news conference, but it's never okay to commit violence. What are the politics of this group?
Well, obviously, they, traffic in the politics of extremism. But I will say this, I'm a lifelong Michigander. It's no secret that we've had issues with militia groups in Michigan before. And obviously, you can go back to the Oklahoma City bombing and see that there was a relationship between Michigan militia groups and that horrible event. But things had died down for quite some time. But I will say that things have escalated exponentially recently, and with the combination of a few things. First of all, of course, we having a president that seems to condone these types of actions. Certainly, I would say more than dog whistles out there, right? I mean, very good people on both sides. And as you indicated before, tweets to liberate Michigan. What does that mean exactly? And calls to stand back and stand by when you're talking about the Proud Boys. So this is a president that traffics in extremism, and I hear the press frequently talk about it in terms of a dog whistle to these groups. But to me, it's not a dog whistle. It's really a command to action more than anything. And especially I see that in terms of our governor. What these groups often tend to do is they take advantage of moments of civil unrest. And between the COVID epidemic and the Black Lives Matter protests, things have only escalated more and more. And you've seen this hateful rhetoric against our governor for months and months. And you've seen it enabled not just by the president, but by other elected leaders in our state that call her a dictator or use other very hostile language towards her. And I think that this has been building up for a long time. Certainly the FBI has taken note of it. And it was time to step in and to ensure that she did not lose her life and that we didn't have anyone else in our state potentially threatened either. So it was time to move forward on these 13 different defendants.
You talk about extremists. You say they're extremists. Are you calling them right-wing extremists? Were they supporters of the president? Did they take the president's words as a call to action specifically? Did you see that, or did you hear that in the conversations? Did you see that in any of the online activity?
Well, I think the facts and the evidence will present itself during the course of the case. But let me speak more generally about these groups and what we have seen. Some of them, oddly, do have pro-Trump stances, but many of them are just anti-government altogether, no matter who's in the government. But what concerns me is this. We see many different events that are these protests, whether they be at the Capitol or in other areas of our state. And what concerns me the most is that you'll see these armed militants and in their paramilitary uniforms, toting around their assault weapons. But then you'll see our elected officials literally hobnobbing with them and joining in and speaking at their events, including, by the way, many county sheriffs. And many of these were the county sheriffs that absolutely refused to enforce the governor's orders. And so what it does is it lends legitimacy to them. It lends credibility to these groups, to these organizations, and to their membership. And it serves as a recruiting tool for them because they have people from our government standing up and supporting them. And I think all of that sort of has escalated to the situation where we find ourselves right now, and it's not a good place to be.
Were these suspects connected to the Second Amendment rally that we saw in front of the state capitol earlier this spring?
I think that when you take a look at who was at that event and you cross-reference it with the names of the people that we've charged, you'll see that many of them, in fact, were in attendance.
Do they have any connection to white supremacy?
A lot of these groups are sort of intermixed with each other. So just because they might be in another group, it doesn't mean that they don't have other associations with other groups. So I would say they're a mixture of militia groups and white supremacy groups. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish one from the other, quite honestly, because sometimes their beliefs are so similar to one another. But there are a number of different groups that are out there that are out, not just in Michigan, but across many jurisdictions and across many states.
The Wolverine Watchmen, is this the same group that was already on the FBI's radar that was, I guess, talking about targeting law enforcement?
Yeah, this group and many others, I would say, fall into that category.
In terms of the backgrounds of some of these militia members, anybody have a background in the military that you've been able to determine?
Yes, we've seen people who have backgrounds in the military that have gotten involved with these organizations. But what concerns me, I would say, more than that, are just sort of the loose associations at all with law enforcement. And when I say that, I really, again, I'm talking about county sheriffs that I've actually seen at some of these events. It's very upsetting to me. And of course, we have heard about groups that sort of feel as though they have their own sense of justice, their own legal system. And we know that, for instance, some of these actors that were charged today intended to put the governor on trial in their own justice system and to issue their own verdict as to whether she was guilty of treason. And it's very, very concerning.
I think some viewers might be a little confused because on the one hand, you're saying that they have connections to law enforcement, but they are also going to target law enforcement. Explain how both those things can be true at once.
Well, what I'm saying is that we have seen a number of times where these individuals will be at events, sometimes protesting against the governor, only there are also law enforcement individuals that are speaking at the same event, sometimes held and co-sponsored by these militia members. I know it's confusing, and different individuals and different groups have different philosophies, but that's what I'm saying. I have a hard time as a law enforcement official seeing how any law enforcement officials could possibly support these types of groups or want to intermingle with them or want to participate in any of their events. But I'm telling you that that is what we have actually seen. But I will say this that I'm very happy about, and that is that we had great cooperation between state authorities and with federal authorities. So I think it's important for people to know this is not political. I just was on a stage with Trump appointees who worked hand in hand with my office. I'm a Democrat. This has nothing to do with our politics. It has nothing to do with our, political persuasion. It's law. When you talk about law and order, what you saw on that stage, what you see us doing today in terms of these charges, that is what is law and order, not what the president has been talking about, not supporting this type of criminal activity.
Are you sure that the threat is gone? There are a number of other militias in Michigan. You just said so a moment ago. Is everything okay now, or are you actively watching other groups right now? Are you worried about other threats?
I'm worried about additional threats.
Any timeline on when we might see potential charges?
No, but I will tell you this may very well be the tip of the iceberg. I don't feel as though our work or the work of the federal authorities is complete. And I think there are still dangerous individuals that are out there. And it is a point of great concern. And that's why I think it's so important that our elected leaders tone down the rhetoric and make it clear once and for all. and to be unequivocal about the fact that they do not condone and they actually condemn these individuals and this type of conduct and these type of organizations.
Are you worried about the election, specifically Election Day and the following weeks, if there is not a clear winner immediately, or even if there is?
Well, I will tell you that we're doing everything we can in the state of Michigan to ensure that doesn't happen. We have planned for every set of circumstances, every contingency that you can imagine. And we're working with our partners in law enforcement. We're working with the Michigan State Police and with the county sheriffs and all the municipal police departments to ensure that Election Day and afterwards, the tabulation of the ballots is safe and secure, and that everyone knows that they can go to the polls and not have to worry about their safety. We are making sure of it, and I want to communicate to your viewers that they don't have to worry about whether it's safe to vote or not. It is safe, and whether you decide to vote absentee or whether you decide to vote in person on Election Day, you will not have to worry about your safety. We are making very certain of that, and so we are planning for any set of circumstances to make sure that our state residents are safe. And I know the same thing is being done in states all across the country.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.